Desperately trying to keep the bank from foreclosing on the only thing his old man had left him, 17-year-old Theo was elbows deep in a busted radiator when the first Hell's Angel rolled into his shop. The air hung thick with the scent of burned rubber and stale sweat. CIO didn't fix the biker's tire to play the hero. He did it because it's just what you do. He never expected that a week later, 800 leather-clad outlaws would turn his crumbling driveway into a fortress. The heat off the asphalt was thick enough to chew. It was mid-August in a town that didn't matter, sitting 10 miles off a highway people only used to get somewhere else. His old man's shop, O'Connor Auto, was a hollowed-out cinder-block husk that smelled permanently of oxidized metal, cheap degreaser, and failure. CO was lying under a rusted 04 Chevy Silverado, sweat pooling in the hollow of his throat, trying to break loose a stripped oil pan bolt. His knuckles were already scraped raw, the cuts packed with black grease that stung like battery acid. The wrench slipped. His knuckles slammed into the undercarriage. He didn't yell. He just closed his eyes, let the heavy, dull ache pulse up his forearm, and wished for the 100th time that week he could just burn the place down for the insurance money. Except his dad had let the policy lapse 2 years before his liver finally quit on him. That's when the vibration started. It wasn't a sound at first. It was a tremor in the concrete floor that traveled up through his boots and settled in his ribs. Then came the noise. A deep, guttural thumping, like a massive heartbeat struggling for rhythm. It was accompanied by the distinct, sickening sound of a flat, heavy rubber tire slapping against the pavement. CIO slid out from under the Chevy, wiping a mix of sweat and oil off his forehead with the back of a dirty forearm. A motorcycle was limping into the dirt lot. Not just a motorcycle, a massive, stripped-down Harley-Davidson Road Glide. It was painted a matte, bruised black, the chrome scuffed and dull. The rider cut the engine, and the silence that followed felt heavy. He kicked the stand down. The guy was huge, built like a brick wall wearing a faded denim cut. His beard was gray wire, his skin tanned to the texture of a worn-out baseball glove. On the back of his vest, the red and white winged death's head stared back at Theo. Hell's Angels. The top rocker said, "Nomad." CIO swallowed hard. His mouth tasted like copper and dust. He was a skinny 17-year-old kid in overalls that were 3 sizes too big, standing in a shop that barely had working lights. "Rear's shot?" The biker grunted. His voice sounded like it had been dragged over gravel. He didn't look angry, just deeply inconvenienced. He smelled of hot engine oil, stale tobacco, and miles of road sweat. CIO walked over, staring at the back tire. There was a jagged piece of twisted scrap metal, looked like a shredded piece of highway siding, buried deep in the rubber. The sidewall was chewed up, but the rim looked intact. "I don't have motorcycle tires," CO told him. His voice cracked slightly, which pissed him off. "This is an auto shop, mostly tractors and rusted-out sedans." He looked at CO. His eyes were pale blue, set deep in a weathered face. They didn't hold a threat, but they held a weight that made the teenager want to look away. "Got a patch kit? Tube?" "Yeah," CO mumbled. "I can try. But with a tear that size, a patch won't hold past the county line. Just need it to hold to the next chapter house," he said, pulling a crushed pack of cigarettes from his pocket. He lit one, the sharp scent of cheap tobacco cutting through the smell of hot asphalt. "You turning me away, kid?" CO looked at the bike, then at the cash register inside that currently held $42. He needed $150 by tomorrow to keep the water running. "Bring it into the bay," CO said, turning away before the biker could see his hands shaking. Getting the rear wheel off a touring Harley without a motorcycle lift is a miserable, spine-compressing job. CIO had to rig a pair of hydraulic car jacks and a block of wood under the frame, praying the whole heavy beast didn't tip over and crush his leg. The biker, He didn't offer his name, and CEO didn't ask, just stood by the open bay door, smoking in silence, watching the highway. The tire iron was cold in CEO's hands. He wrestled the stiff, heavy rubber off the rim, the muscles in his back screaming. Every time he slipped, the metal pinged loudly against the concrete, echoing in the empty shop. He pulled the shredded inner tube out. It smelled like hot powder and friction. CEO found a heavy-duty truck patch. It was ugly, meant for a dually, not a precision machine. He slathered the vulcanizing cement on, the sharp chemical reek of it making his eyes water. He clamped it down, waiting the agonizing 10 minutes for the bond to cure. "You run this place alone?" he asked suddenly. The cigarette was gone, replaced by another. "Since my dad died," Keogh said. He didn't want his pity. He shoved the tube back into the tire, the rubber fighting him every inch of the way. "How old are you?" "Old enough to run the air compressor." Keogh shot back, instantly regretting the smart mouth. He just huffed a breath that might have been a laugh. CEO got the tire back on the rim, seated the bead with a loud pop that made him flinch, and bolted the heavy wheel back onto the swing arm. He checked the tension on the drive belt, wiped his greasy prints off the fender with a clean rag, and lowered the jacks. "It's ugly," CEO said, pointing to the bulge where the truck patch sat inside the tire. "Do not take this over 60. It gets hot, that patch melts, and you're eating asphalt." He walked over, kicking the tire lightly with a heavy steel-toed boot. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a thick roll of bills secured with a rubber band. He peeled off $300 bills and held them out. Tio stared at the green paper. His stomach twisted. It was more than enough to pay the water bill and buy groceries for a month. But a sudden stupid surge of pride, or maybe just a cynical survival instinct, kicked in. If he took a massive overpayment from a Hell's Angel, did that mean he owed him? Did that put him on some radar he desperately wanted to avoid? "Patch is $15, Xio said, his voice tight. "Labor is 20, make it 35. He raised an eyebrow, the deep lines in his forehead deepening. "Take the money, kid." 35. Xio insisted, crossing his arms over his greasy chest. "I don't run a charity, and I don't take tips. I just fix things." He looked at Xio for a long, heavy second. Then slowly, he put 2 of the hundreds back in the roll. He handed the mechanic $100 bill. "Keep the change. Buy a better jack." He threw a leg over the bike, hit the ignition, and the heavy engine roared to life, drowning out whatever Xio was going to say. He didn't wave. He just dumped the clutch and rolled out into the heat shimmer of the highway, leaving Xio standing in a cloud of exhaust and dust. Xio looked at the $100 bill in his hand. It was dirty and crumpled. He shoved it in his pocket, went to the sink, and started scrubbing the grease off his arms with grit soap. He figured he'd never see him again. He figured that was the end of it. He was a cynical idiot. 3 days later, the reality of the town came knocking. His name was Roy Garrison. Roy wasn't a mob boss or a criminal mastermind. He was a local real estate bottom feeder with too much cheap cologne and a handful of meth-addicted cousins who acted as his muscle. He was buying up all the failing lots on the edge of town, planning to flip the land to a commercial developer building a distribution center. CIO's shop was dead center in the proposed footprint. CIO was sitting at the front desk, staring at a past-due electricity notice, when Garrison's black Escalade crunched into the gravel lot. The smell of the dust coming through the screen door was immediately overpowered by the scent of Axe body spray and stale beer as 3 men walked in. Garrison was a soft man in a hard suit. His face was flushed, slick with sweat in the stifling air of the office. Behind him stood 2 of his cousins, tall, twitchy guys with hollowed-out eyes and knuckles covered in scabs. "CEO, buddy," Garrison said, stepping inside without wiping his feet. His voice was too loud, too cheerful. "Hot one today, huh? Place smells like... Well, it smells like a dying business. What do you want, Roy? CO kept his hands under the desk. His heart was starting to hammer a frantic rhythm against his ribs. He wasn't tough. He knew how to take a hit because his dad used to drink, but he didn't know how to throw one. I'm just checking in on my favorite young entrepreneur. Garrison smiled, showing teeth that were too white. Seeing if you've reconsidered my offer on the land. It's a generous offer, Tio. Generous. Your dad, God rest him, left you a sinking ship. I'm throwing you a life preserver. The offer was a joke, Roy. It barely covers the back taxes. CIO stood up, trying to look taller than he was. I'm not selling. Garrison's smile vanished. The soft, sweaty facade dropped, revealing the ugly, petty tyrant underneath. He sighed, adjusting his cuffs. You're a kid, CO. You don't understand how the world works. Sometimes life preservers are mandatory. He nodded to the taller of the two cousins. The guy didn't hesitate. He picked up a heavy cast-iron brake rotor sitting on the counter and casually tossed it through the front window. The glass shattered with a deafening crash, jagged shards raining down on the linoleum floor. CAO flinched violently, throwing his arms up over his face. The sharp, mineral smell of broken glass filled the room. Hey! CO yelled, his voice cracking in panic. He stepped out from behind the desk. The second cousin stepped forward and shoved him hard in the chest. CAO went flying backward, his shoulder slamming into the edge of a metal filing cabinet. Pain flared hot and bright, stealing his breath. He slid to the floor, gasping. He wasn't brave. He didn't jump up and fight them off. He stayed on the floor, clutching his shoulder, his eyes watering from the pain and the sheer, humiliating helplessness of it. Look at this place, Garrison said, stepping over a pile of broken glass. He walked into the main bay. CIO scrambled to his feet, dragging himself to the doorway. The cousins were methodical. They picked up heavy wrenches and started smashing the headlights of a customer's Toyota. They kicked over a rolling tool chest, Kyo's dad's tool chest. The heavy steel drawers slid open, scattering sockets, wrenches, and ratchets across the greasy floor. The metallic clatter was deafening, a chaotic symphony of destruction. Every crash felt like a punch to the gut. Stop! Please! CO begged. It was pathetic, but he didn't care. That tool chest was the only thing he had left that mattered. You see, CO? Garrison called out over the noise. He was standing by the open bay door, hands in his pockets. Accidents happen in old, unsafe buildings. Vandalism, break-ins. Insurance premiums go up. Oh wait, you don't have insurance, do you? Next time, maybe a fire breaks out. Faulty wiring. Tragic. He walked back over to Kaio, who was leaning against the doorframe, trembling. CO hated him, but mostly he hated himself for being so weak. I'll bring the paperwork by on Friday, Garrison said softly, patting CO's uninjured shoulder. Sign it, and you walk away with a few grand. Don't, and you walk away with nothing but ashes. They piled back into the Escalade and drove off, leaving the teenager standing in the ruins. The silence that followed was suffocating. CIO walked into the bay. The smell of spilled coolant, sickly sweet and neon green, was pooling around the smashed Toyota. His dad's tools were everywhere. He dropped to his knees, picking up a heavy half-inch drive ratchet. It was cold and familiar in his hand. He didn't scream to the heavens. He didn't swear vengeance. He just sat on the filthy concrete floor, surrounded by broken glass and spilled fluids, and let the tears cut clean tracks through the grease on his face. He was done. Garrison had won. He'd signed the papers on Friday. Thursday morning, the air was thick with the threat of a thunderstorm that refused to break. The sky was the color of bruised iron. CIO had spent the last 2 days sweeping up glass and trying to put his dad's tools back in some kind of order. The Toyota's owner had yelled at him for 20 minutes before having his car towed, promising a lawsuit CIO couldn't afford to defend. Seo was sitting on an overturned bucket outside the bay doors, a roll of duct tape in his hand, staring at nothing. He was waiting for Friday. He was waiting to surrender. Around noon, the air pressure seemed to drop. The hair on his arms stood up, a prickling sensation that made him rub the back of his neck. He thought it was the storm finally rolling in. Then he heard it. It wasn't a rumble this time. It was a roar. It started low, a vibration that shook the loose corrugated tin on the roof of the shop. Dust started to dance across the dirt lot. The sound swelled, multiplying, echoing off the distant hills until it became a physical weight, pressing against his eardrums. It sounded like a freight train was driving straight down the 2-lane highway. CIO stood up, dropping the tape. He walked to the edge of the lot, squinting down the road. The heat shimmer distorted the horizon, but through the haze he saw the headlights. Dozens of them. Then hundreds. A massive, unbroken column of motorcycles was rolling down the highway, riding 2 abreast in perfect formation. The chrome flashed blindly under the dark sky. The sheer volume of the noise, the synchronized thunder of hundreds of V-twin engines, vibrated in his teeth. They began to slow down as they approached the shop. The lead rider cut his turn signal and banked off the asphalt onto the gravel lot. The crunch of the tires was instantly swallowed by the roar of the engines following him. It was the guy, the nomad. He rode straight into the center of the lot, cut his engine, and put his kickstand down. But the noise didn't stop. Behind him, bikes kept pouring into the lot. 10, 20, 50. They filled the dirt spaces. They parked along the grassy ditch. They lined up shoulder to shoulder, completely blocking the entrance to the shop from the highway. The air instantly filled with the intense heat radiating from the engines, the smell of exhaust, hot oil, and worn leather. CEO's heart was in his throat. He backed up until his shoulders hit the cinder block wall of the shop. He had no idea what was happening. Were they here to rob him? To finish what Garrison started? The engines were killed in a rolling wave, replaced by the mechanical ticks of hot metal cooling down and the heavy thud of boots hitting the gravel. Men and women, all wearing the death's head patch, leather cuts over hoodies, heavily tattooed arms, scars, and road-weary faces. They weren't looking at him with malice. They were just there. The big nomad walked toward Suyo. He looked at the boarded-up front window, the shattered glass still glittering in the dirt, and the fresh bruise purpling on the kid's jaw. "Look like you had some trouble, kid," he said. His gravelly voice was quiet in the sudden aftermath of the roar. CEO's voice failed. He swallowed hard. "A local guy. Wants my land. He sent some guys to persuade me." The nomad nodded slowly. He pulled out a cigarette, struck a match against the zipper of his jacket, and lit it. He exhaled a long plume of smoke into the muggy air. "He coming back?" "Tomorrow," Chio whispered. "To make me sign the deed." The nomad turned around. He looked at the sea of leather and chrome occupying the property. There had to be 200 bikes already parked, and CEO could still hear more coming down the highway. He looked back at CEO. "Your patch held. Got me to the chapter house in Reno." "I told you not to take it over 60, CEO said, the mechanic in him overriding his terror for a split second. He smirked. "I took it to 85. It held." He took another drag of his cigarette. "I mentioned to the brothers that a kid in a rundown shop gave me a square deal when he could have robbed me blind. In our world, respect is currency. You paid out, kid. Now we're paying back." He pointed a heavy, calloused finger at the road. "We're having a regional run this weekend. 800 riders. Figured we needed a place to set up a checkpoint. Rest the bikes. Maybe get some oil changes." He looked directly into CEO's eyes. "If you're open for business." CEO stared at him, then at the hundreds of bikers currently pulling coolers off their bikes, leaning against the walls of the shop, effectively turning the doomed property into an impenetrable fortress. The sheer, absurd reality of it washed over him. He wasn't saved by the police, or a lawyer, or a miracle. He was being guarded by the most notorious outlaw motorcycle club in the world, because he didn't overcharge for a tire patch. "I'm open," Keo choked out, a bizarre mix of a sob and a laugh escaping his chest. "Good," the nomad said, turning toward the highway. "Because I want to meet this Garrison guy tomorrow." By nightfall, Ceo's gravel lot looked less like a failing auto shop and more like a besieged military encampment. The air was thick with a haze of blue exhaust smoke and the smell of roasting meat. They had set up split-barrel smokers and fire pits near the drainage ditch, feeding the flames with dead wood they'd dragged from the tree line. The sharp, alkaline scent of the wood smoke mixed with the persistent odor of hot engine oil, stale beer, and unwashed denim. It was an overwhelming, deeply male smell that seemed to settle onto Ceo's skin and into the fabric of his oversized overalls. Ceo was locked inside his office. He had dragged a filing cabinet in front of the door, an entirely useless gesture considering the sheer mass of humanity outside. If they wanted in, a thin sheet of particle board wasn't going to stop them. Through the cracked slats of the plastic blinds, he watched them. There was no chaotic rioting, no wild movie-style partying. It was structured, intense. There was a low, constant murmur of voices, punctuated occasionally by a sharp laugh or the clinking of heavy glass bottles. Men with heavily inked arms and weathered faces sat on upturned milk crates or the heavy leather saddles of their bikes. Ceo felt incredibly small. He wasn't their brother. He wasn't their friend. He was just the kid who happened to own the dirt they were currently standing on. He felt a twisted, ugly knot of contradiction in his stomach. He was terrified of these men who wore patches denoting things he didn't want to understand, but he was equally terrified of them leaving. If they left, Garrison would return, and his dad's shop would be reduced to a memory and a cheap commercial development. He was trapped by his own salvation. Around 2 a.m., the claustrophobia in the office finally outweighed his fear of the lot. CIO shoved the filing cabinet aside. It screeched against the linoleum, loud enough to make him wince. He opened the door and stepped out into the main bay. The air was cooler now, but the humidity clung to everything like a wet rag. A massive guy with a braided beard and a patch that read Sergeant at Arms was sitting on a mechanic's creeper just inside the bay, slowly sharpening a buck knife on a whetstone. The sh-sh sound of the steel scraping against the stone was methodical. He stopped and looked up at Ceo. His eyes were dark, unreadable in the dim light of the single fluorescent bulb humming overhead. "Can't sleep?" he asked. His voice was a low rumble. "Hot in there." Ceo lied, his voice tight. He went back to the whetstone. "Shh, shh. Huck says you're a decent wrench. That true, or did he just get lucky with that patch?" "Huck, that must be the nomad." "I know enough," Keo said, leaning against the doorframe, trying to look casual while his knees felt like water. A younger guy, maybe mid-20s, thin but corded with tight muscle, walked into the bay. He was carrying a detached clutch cable. It was snapped clean at the lever housing. He smelled heavily of whiskey and sour sweat. "Hey, kid," the younger guy said, holding up the frayed cable. "Got anything that'll fit a 98 Dyna? Snapped it pulling into the dirt. Got a ride out by Sunday." Keo looked at the broken cable. The panic receded just a fraction, replaced by the familiar, cold logic of mechanics. Metal he understood. Broken things he could fix. "I don't stock Harley parts," Ceo said, walking over to the heavy red tool chest his dad left him. The one Garrison's goons had kicked over. He had spent hours putting the sockets back in their rails. "But I have universal braided steel lines and a crimping tool. I can cut a new line, solder a brass nipple onto the end, and seat it in the housing." The young biker looked at the sergeant at arms, then back at Ceo. He tossed the broken cable onto the greasy concrete. "Do it. What's it cost?" $40 for the materials," Ceo said, forcing himself to hold his gaze. 20 for the labor. He dug into his pocket, pulled out 3 crumpled $20 bills, and slammed them on the nearest workbench. Theo went to work. He turned on the halogen work light, the heat instantly radiating against his face. He dug out the spool of braided cable. Measuring it against the old one, his hands were surprisingly steady. The smell of the rosin core solder hitting the hot iron, sweet, sharp, and metallic, filled the bay, pushing away the scent of the bikers for just a moment. He focused on the liquid silver pooling around the brass nipple, blowing on it gently until it dulled and hardened into a solid joint. When Theo handed the finished cable back, the younger guy tugged on the brass end hard, testing the bond. It held. He gave Theo a single terse nod, picked up his money, left $40, and walked out. The sergeant-at-arms hadn't stopped sharpening his knife. He blew the metal dust off the blade. "Get some sleep, kid. Tomorrow's Friday." Theo went back to the office, but he didn't barricade the door this time. He sat in his dad's worn leather chair, staring at the ceiling, waiting for the sun to rise, and wondering what the hell was going to happen when Roy Garrison pulled up. The sky turned a bruised purple before bleeding into a dull, flat grey. The thunderstorm still hadn't broken. The air was suffocatingly thick, heavy with anticipation, and the smell of dew trapped beneath 800 hot engines. By 8:30 a.m., the camp was awake. It wasn't the groggy, slow morning of a normal campground. It was the sharp, immediate wakefulness of a military unit. Sleeping bags were rolled tightly, trash was thrown into heavy black bags, and thermoses of black coffee were passed around in silence. Kyo stood by the open bay doors, a mug of instant coffee in his hand. It tasted like ash, but he needed the heat in his stomach to stop the shivering. At 9:15 a.m., the crunch of heavy tires on gravel broke the low murmur of the camp. Garrison's black Escalade turned off the highway. It was moving too fast, aggressive and entitled, until it hit the sheer wall of motorcycles blocking the entrance. The SUV slammed on its brakes, the heavy front end diving as it came to a halt inches from a row of parked Softails. The silence that fell over the lot was instantaneous and terrifying. It wasn't a shocked silence. It was a tactical one. 800 men stopped what they were doing. No one yelled. No one drew a weapon. They simply turned their heads and stared at the Escalade. The sheer weight of that collective, predatory gaze felt like a physical pressure dropping out of the sky. Garrison honked the horn. A long, obnoxious blast. It was the dumbest thing he could have possibly done. Huck, the nomad, had been sitting on a flipped bucket near the edge of the lot, drinking from a styrofoam cup. He stood up slowly. He didn't rush. He walked through the sea of parked bikes, his heavy boots crunching loudly in the dead quiet. A path parted for him effortlessly. Garrison's driver's side door opened. Roy stepped out, wearing a crisp blue suit, holding a manila folder. His 2 meth-addicted cousins piled out of the back. They looked twitchy, their eyes darting around the massive crowd, their hands hovering near their waistbands. Garrison slapped a fake, wide smile on his face, though Sayo could see the sweat instantly bead on his forehead. He puffed his chest out, trying to project authority into a space that had entirely rejected him. "Morning, gentlemen," Garrison announced, his voice too loud, cracking slightly. "Impressive gathering, real impressive. I'm just here to see CIO. Got some paperwork for the kid to sign, then we'll be out of your hair." Huck stopped about 5 feet from Garrison. He looked at the real estate agent with the same flat, mildly inconvenienced expression he had when he showed up with a flat tire. "Kid's busy," Huck rasped. He didn't raise his voice, but the gravelly pitch carried perfectly in the quiet. "He's running a business. We're his clients." "Well, that's fine," Garrison said, taking a step forward. "This will only take a second. CIO, come on out here, buddy." CO didn't move from the bay door. His feet felt anchored to the concrete. Huck didn't turn around. He just shifted his weight slightly, completely blocking Garrison's line of sight to the shop. "You deaf, Suit? I said he's busy." The taller of the two cousins, the one who had thrown the brake rotor through CIO's window, pushed past Garrison. He shoved a finger hard into Huck's chest. "Hey, old man," the cousin snarled, spit flying from his lips. "He said he needs the kid. Move." Time seemed to stutter. Huck didn't flinch. He didn't swing. He simply grabbed the cousin's extended finger. He didn't twist it. He just gripped it with a massive, calloused hand and squeezed. The cousin's face went white. He dropped to his knees in the gravel, letting out a sharp, choked gasp of pure agony. Behind Huck, the silence broke. It wasn't a roar. It was the sound of leather creaking, heavy boots shifting on the dirt, and the distinct metallic clack-clack of a pump-action shotgun being racked somewhere deep in the crowd. The sound was deafening in its implications. Garrison froze. The color drained completely from his face, leaving his fake tan looking sickly and yellow. The second cousin took 3 rapid steps backward, his hands held up by his shoulders. Huck released the kneeling man's finger. The guy stayed on the ground, cradling his hand against his chest, whimpering softly. "You're trespassing," Huck said, his voice dropping an octave. Garrison swallowed audibly. His eyes darted past Huck, finally locking onto Keo standing in the bay door. He wasn't looking at a kid he could bully anymore. He was looking at a kid backed by an army. "Tio!" Garrison stammered, holding up the manila folder. His hands were shaking violently. "The deed, the offer." "I'm not selling, Roy," Tio said. His voice was surprisingly steady, though his heart was beating so hard it hurt his ribs. "Get off my lot." Huck reached out and plucked the folder from Garrison's trembling hand. He opened it, looked at the contract for a brief second, and then handed it to a biker standing to his left. A guy with a teardrop tattoo under his eye. The tattooed biker took the folder, walked over to one of the smoking split-barrel fire pits, and dropped the paperwork directly onto the hot coals. The thick paper curled, blackened, and burst into bright orange flames. "You have 10 seconds to get that piece of shit SUV off this property," Huck told Garrison, maintaining heavy eye contact. "Or we'll flip it onto its roof and you can walk back to town." Garrison didn't say another word. He practically fell back into the driver's seat. The cousin on the ground scrambled up, stumbling as he threw himself into the back. The Escalade slammed into reverse, the tires spinning wildly in the gravel, kicking up a shower of dirt and small rocks before it fishtailed onto the highway and sped away, breaking the speed limit in a desperate bid for escape. CIO stood in the doorway, staring at the dust settling on the highway. He should have felt triumphant. He should have felt like a hero who had vanquished the villain. Instead, he just felt a cold, sick nausea pooling in his gut. He hadn't won anything. He had just witnessed raw, unadulterated power squash a petty bully. He was completely out of his depth, playing a game with pieces that could crush him just as easily as they crushed Garrison. Huck turned around and looked at Kaio. He didn't smile. He just nodded once, walked back to his overturned bucket, and picked up his cold coffee. The camp went back to its low murmur, the tension evaporating as quickly as it had formed. Garrison didn't come back. The local police cruiser drove slowly past the shop twice that afternoon, the officer inside taking one look at the sheer mass of motorcycles and the patches on the leather vests before deciding that whatever was happening out there was above his pay grade. He kept driving. With the threat gone, a strange, suffocating reality settled over Tio. It was Friday afternoon. The Angels had said they were using his lot as a checkpoint for the weekend. He had 72 hours of living with an occupying force. Tio retreated into the only thing that made sense to him, the work. He dragged a rolling tool cart out to the edge of the concrete pad. Word had spread through the camp that the kid wasn't totally useless. By 2 p.m., a line had formed. It wasn't major rebuilds. It was the frantic, desperate maintenance of road-weary machines. A primary chain tensioner that needed adjusting, a weeping fork seal, a pair of worn-out brake pads that were grinding metal on metal. CIO didn't do it for free. He charged them exactly what the manual dictated for labor, plus a 5% markup on the fluids he had in stock. They paid in crumpled bills, heavy silver coins, and gruff nods. He was working on a massive customized Electroglide, trying to bleed the rear brake lines. The bleeder valve was rusted shut, stubbornly refusing to turn. He was sweating profusely, his knuckles white as he strained against the tiny wrench, terrified he was going to snap the head off the valve. "Don't force it, kid." Tayo looked up, wiping his forehead with a greasy shoulder. A biker was standing over him. He was older, maybe late 60s, with a stark white beard and a faded tattoo of a panther crawling up his left forearm. The rocker on his back said, "San Badu." "It's seized," CO grunted, shifting his grip. "If I heat it, I risk melting the line." "Tap it," the older biker said. He reached into his vest pocket and pulled out a heavy, brass-headed hammer that looked 50 years old. He handed it to Keo. "Light taps on the housing. Break the rust bond inside the threads before you torque it. Your old man never teach you patience?" The casual mention of his dad made CO's throat tighten. He took the brass hammer. It was heavy, perfectly balanced. "He taught me," Kyo said quietly. He tapped the housing around the bleeder valve. Tink, tink, tink. But he lost his patience a long time ago, spent the last 3 years of his life in the bottom of a bottle of ancient age. The shop went to hell while he was busy drinking himself into an early grave. Teo didn't know why he said it. It was a raw, ugly truth he usually kept buried. Maybe it was the exhaustion or the adrenaline crash from the morning, or just the fact that these men didn't look like they dealt in polite fictions. The older biker didn't look shocked or offer empty pity. He just watched YO's hands. "Demons allowed," he said simply. "Sometimes the only way to drown 'em out is with something louder. For some guys it's whiskey. For us it's the road." He pointed to the wrench. "Try it now." Xio put the wrench back on the valve and applied a steady, even pressure. It gave a microscopic crack, the rust breaking free, and turned smoothly. Dark, old brake fluid began to weep into the clear plastic tubing he had set up. "There it is," the biker said. He reached down, took his brass hammer back, and wiped it on his jeans. "You got good hands, kid, but you're holding a lot of tension in your shoulders. You wrench angry, you're gonna strip bolts and break knuckles. Trust the metal. It does what it's supposed to do if you ask it right." He walked away, leaving Xio crouching over the bike. Xio watched the dark fluid bleed out, replaced slowly by the clear amber color of fresh DOT4. He took a deep breath, forcing his shoulders to drop. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the dirt lot, Xio stood up and stretched his aching back. His hands were covered in a thick layer of grease, brake dust, and dried blood from scraped knuckles. He smelled terrible. His muscles were screaming, but as he looked around the lot, something shifted in his chest. The fire pits were blazing again. The low rumble of voices mixed with the rhythmic, thumping idle of a few bikes being tuned in the distance. The sharp smell of ozone from someone welding a cracked frame bracket near the ditch cut through the smoke. Xio realized, with a profound, startling clarity, that the shop wasn't dead. For 2 years, this place had been a tomb, a quiet, decaying monument to his father's failure and his own impending defeat. The silence used to echo off the cinder-block walls, reminding him every day of how alone he was. But right now, the air was vibrating. It was loud, chaotic, and dangerous. But it was alive. Xio walked back to the bay and grabbed a shop rag. He stood in the doorway, scrubbing the worst of the grease off his palms. He wasn't naive. He knew these men were outlaws. He knew they lived by a code of violence and loyalty that he wanted no part of. He knew that by Monday morning they would be gone, and he would be alone again with a dirt lot and a shattered front window. But Garrison wouldn't be back. The debt his father left behind was still there, but the immediate threat was erased. Not by the law, not by fairness, but by the unpredictable, jagged edge of karma delivered by a man who appreciated a cheap tire patch. Huck walked past the bay door, carrying a heavy cooler of ice. He stopped, looking at Tio, wiping his hands. "You shutting down for the night, kid?" he asked. Tio looked at the line of 3 bikes still waiting near the concrete pad. He looked at the heavy red tool chest, the drawers pushed closed, ready for the next job. "No," Tio said, throwing the filthy rag onto a workbench. "I've got a few more in me. Send the next one up." Huck gave a single, gruff laugh that sounded like a cough. "Right, don't overcharge 'em. Labor is labor." Keo shot back, stepping out into the heat of the night. He walked toward the next bike, a massive Heritage Softail leaking primary oil. He wasn't a hero, he wasn't a biker. He was just CIO, a mechanic trying to survive the weekend. But for the first time since his dad died, his hands were steady. Saturday broke like a fever. The sun didn't rise so much as it ignited the horizon, baking the dampness out of the dirt lot and replacing it with a suffocating, dusty heat. By 10 in the morning, the temperature was hovering near 90, and the smell of the encampment had evolved. The sharp tang of morning coffee gave way to the heavy, fermented stench of stale beer, hot leather, and the unmistakable, metallic scent of heated engine blocks cooling in the sun. His shop had transformed into a triage center. Word had officially circulated through the 800 riders that the kid in the cinderblock shack didn't screw people over. CIO didn't have time to think about Roy Garrison, or the bank, or the fact that he was technically aiding and abetting a known criminal enterprise. He was drowning in a sea of broken machinery. Around noon, a kid who couldn't have been much older than Tio pushed a sputtering, oil-slicked Sportster into the bay. He was wearing a fresh leather cut, stiff and unweathered. The bottom rocker was blank. The front patch just read, "Prospect." He looked completely exhausted, his eyes rimmed with red dust and lack of sleep. His hands were shaking as he let the kickstand drop. "Status fried?" the prospect said. He didn't introduce himself. CIO later heard one of the older guys call him Rat. He had the nervous, frantic energy of an animal backed into a corner. "Battery's dead. I've been push-starting this heavy bitch for the last 200 miles. If I drop out of the formation on the ride back tomorrow, my sponsor is going to strip my cut and leave me on the shoulder." CIO looked at the primary cover on the left side of the bike. It was weeping black oil onto his concrete. To get to the stator, he'd have to drain the primary fluid, pull the outer cover, unbolt the clutch basket and the compensator sprocket, and pry off the inner rotor. It was a massive job for a fully equipped shop with pneumatic tools. He had hand tools and a single, battered electric impact gun that only worked if you held the cord at a specific angle. "I don't have a replacement stator for a Sportster, man," Tio said, wiping a mixture of sweat and grit from his eyes. "I'm an auto mechanic." "I brought one," Rat said desperately. He unzipped a leather saddlebag and pulled out a cardboard box wrapped in greasy plastic. "Please, I got cash." He didn't sound like a terrifying outlaw. He sounded like a terrified kid who was in way over his head, desperate for validation from men who would probably step over his bleeding body if it served their interests. CIO recognized that look. He used to give his dad that exact same look when he was 10, holding a flashlight perfectly still over an engine bay, praying he wouldn't do something to set off his temper. "Put it on the lift," Tio grunted, kicking a rusted floor jack towards the center of the bay. For the next 3 hours, Tio existed purely in a state of mechanical hyper-focus. The heat inside the bay was oppressive. Every time he moved, his sweat-soaked overalls clung to his skin like wet cellophane. The primary cover bolts were seized from years of neglect. He had to heat them with a propane torch, the smell of burning oil and hot aluminum stinging his nostrils. When he finally cracked the primary cover open, the stench of burnt electrical coils hit the air, a toxic rotten egg smell that made his stomach heave. The old stator was a melted, blackened ruin of copper wire and epoxy. "You ride this hard, you're gonna burn it out again," Keo told Rat. He was sitting on a flipped milk crate, chewing his fingernails down to the quick, watching Teo's hands. "You're running too many auxiliary lights on a stock charging system." "Just fix it," he snapped, the prospect anxiety making him defensive. "I don't need a lecture." Teo stopped. He set his ratchet down on the steel bench. The loud clack of the metal echoed in the bay. He turned to look at him. He was covered in his bike's filth. His knuckles were bleeding again, a fresh gash from a slipping wrench. "I charge $20 an hour for labor," Teo said, his voice dead flat. "I charge $50 an hour if I have to listen to your bullshit. Your choice." Rat blinked. The hard guy facade crumbled instantly. He looked down at his boots. "Sorry, just make it run, man." Teo went back to work. He swapped the stator, wrestling the heavy magnetic rotor back onto the splined shaft. It pinched the webbing between his thumb and index finger, leaving a nasty blood blister, but he didn't make a sound. He torque-wrenched the compensator nut, sealed the primary cover with a fresh bead of liquid gasket, and refilled the fluid. When Teo hooked up his jumper box and hit the starter, the V-twin roared to life. He put a multimeter across the battery terminals. 14.2 volts. It was charging. Rat practically collapsed with relief. He shoved a crumpled wad of bills into Teo's chest. "Thanks, seriously." Teo counted the money. He had given him $200. The labor was barely worth $80. Teo peeled off 2 50s and a 20, shoved them back into his vest pocket, and kept the rest. "Don't overpay," Teo told him, turning back to his workbench to wipe down his tools. "It makes you look like a mark." He didn't turn around to watch him leave, but he heard the crisp, steady idle of his bike fading into the noise of the lot. He leaned heavily against the steel table, the adrenaline draining out of him, leaving nothing but a hollow, aching exhaustion. It was only Saturday afternoon. The atmosphere shifted when the sun finally dropped behind the western ridge. During the day, the encampment felt like a chaotic, blue-collar work site. But as night fell, the heavy, oppressive humidity finally broke, replaced by a cool, sharp breeze that carried the scent of dry pine and incoming rain. The fire pits were stoked higher, throwing erratic, orange shadows against the cinder-block walls of his shop. The drinking changed. The pace accelerated. The low murmur of daytime conversation gave way to loud, jagged laughter and the aggressive, pulsing bass line of heavy metal, pumping from a custom sound system on a touring bike. Teo was sitting in his dark office, the single window open to let the breeze in. He had counted the cash in the register. $840. More money than his dad had made in his last 3 months alive. It was sitting in a neat stack next to the past-due electricity bill. He should have felt elated. Instead, he felt a creeping, cold dread. The reality of who these men were was starting to bleed through the cracks. Around midnight, a scream shattered the bass line. It wasn't a yell of pain. It was a guttural roar of pure, unadulterated rage. CIO jumped out of his dad's leather chair and pressed himself against the wall next to the window, peering out through the slats of the blinds. Near the edge of the drainage ditch, a tight circle of men had formed. In the center, 2 heavy-set bikers were tearing into each other. This wasn't a cinematic bar brawl. It was ugly, clumsy, and brutally violent. One guy caught the other with a heavy, swinging right hook. The sound of knuckles hitting cheekbone was a sickening, wet crack that carried all the way to CEO's office. The struck man stumbled backward, spitting a thick stream of dark blood onto the dirt. He didn't go down. He lunged forward, tackling the other man into the gravel. They rolled into the dirt, gouging, punching, and tearing at each other's faces. Nobody stepped in. The men in the circle just watched, their faces lit by the firelight, completely passive. Some of them were drinking. Some of them were smoking. It was an accepted, necessary bloodletting. A wave of nausea washed over Kaio. He turned away from the window, sliding down the cinder block wall until he was sitting on the linoleum floor. He pulled his knees to his chest. This was the illusion breaking. He had spent 2 days pretending these were just rough guys with a strict moral code, a misunderstood brotherhood. But that was a naive fantasy. They were outlaws. They solved problems with overwhelming force and violence. They had protected him from Garrison not out of some noble sense of justice, but because Garrison had disrespected them by trying to muscle in on a space they were currently occupying. He was just the incidental beneficiary of their absolute territorial dominance. The fight outside ended a few minutes later. CIO didn't look. He just listened to the heavy, ragged breathing and the crunch of boots walking away. The door to his office clicked open. He scrambled to his feet, his heart slamming against his ribs. Huck stood in the doorway. He blocked out the light from the bay, a massive silhouette smelling of wood smoke and stale whiskey. He stepped inside and shut the door behind him. The sudden quiet in the office was deafening. He looked at Sayo. He looked at the stack of cash on the desk. He walked over to Sayo's dad's chair and sat down heavily. The old springs groaned under his weight. Somebody got their jaw wired, Huck said, his voice a low, gravelly rasp. He pulled a cigarette from his cut, lit it, and tossed the match into an empty coffee mug on the desk. Disagreement over a debt. It's settled now. CO stood by the filing cabinet, his hands balled into tight fists. I don't want to know. Huck exhaled a thick cloud of smoke. You saw it out the window, kid. Don't play dumb. It's a bad look. You want me to say I'm grateful? CO snapped, the exhaustion and the fear finally boiling over into a reckless anger. Fine, thank you. Thank you for scaring off the local slumlord. Thank you for paying for your oil changes. But don't sit in my dad's chair and act like we're friends. You guys are going to leave tomorrow, and I'm still going to be the kid in the broken-down shop that a gang of killers used as a rest stop. He waited for him to hit him. He waited for the heavy hand to snap his jaw the way the guy in the ditch just had his. Huck didn't move. He just took another slow drag of his cigarette. His pale blue eyes assessed him, completely devoid of emotion. Your old man drank himself to death, right? Huck asked. The question hit CO like a physical blow. The air rushed out of his lungs. Don't talk about him. I'll talk about whatever I want, Huck said, leaning forward. The leather of his vest creaked. You think you're holding on to some sacred legacy here? This shop is a tomb, CO. Your dad gave up. He let the rust take the metal and the liquor take his brain. He left you with a pile of debt and a target on your back. Shut up, Keo whispered, his voice shaking. Tears of hot, humiliating rage pricked the corners of his eyes. You want to survive in this world? Huck continued, his voice dropping to a harsh, absolute whisper. You have to stop romanticizing the weak. Garrison is weak because he needs goons to do his dirty work. Your dad was weak because he checked out when it got hard. He pointed a thick, calloused finger at Tayo's chest. But you, Huck said, you're standing in a shop surrounded by 800 outlaws telling me you don't want to be my friend. You fixed a prospect spike and didn't gouge him when he was desperate. You got grit, kid, but grit without leverage just grinds you down to dust. He reached into the inner pocket of his leather cut. He pulled out a thick, heavy envelope tied with twine. He tossed it onto the desk. It landed next to CO's neat stack of 20s and 50s with a heavy, definitive thud. What is that? CO asked, not moving. Lot fee, Huck said. We occupied your property for 3 days, used your power, used your water, bled our oil into your dirt. We pay our debts. I don't want your money. Huck stood up. He walked over to Tsayo, stopping inches away. He smelled like road dust and absolute authority. "It's not a gift, it's a transaction. You take that money, you pay off your back taxes, you buy a new window, and you put a goddamn deadbolt on this door, because the next time a wolf comes to your door, I won't be here to bite its head off. You're going to have to do it yourself." He didn't wait for a reply. He turned, opened the office door, and walked back out into the noise and the firelight. CAO stood alone in the dark. He looked at the envelope on the desk. His hands trembled as he reached out and untied the twine. He tipped the envelope over. Stacks of crisp, banded $100 bills slid out onto the battered laminate surface. It was thousands of dollars. Maybe 10 grand. Maybe more. It was blood money. It was extortion money. It was drug money. Teo stared at it, the green ink stark against the dim light. He hated where it came from. He hated the violence that underwrote it. But as he looked at the past-due electricity bill sitting an inch away, a dark, cynical truth settled into his bones. Principles didn't keep the lights on. Survival did. He pushed the money into the top drawer of the desk and locked it. Sunday morning came with the threat of rain finally fulfilling its promise. The sky was a low, bruised grey, and a fine, persistent drizzle was falling, turning the dust of the lot into a slick, greasy mud. The camp woke up with a quiet, synchronized efficiency. There was no lingering. Tents were broken down, trash was bagged and thrown into the dumpsters behind the shop, and gear was strapped tightly to sissy bars. The hangovers were silent and stoic. By 8 a.m., the first engines began to turn over. The chug-chug-chug of the starters was followed by the deep, resonant bark of cold V-twins catching fire. CEO stood under the overhang of the bay door, nursing a cup of black coffee. The humidity made the exhaust smoke hang low over the ground, creating a thick blue fog that smelled sharply of unburned hydrocarbons and wet leather. They formed up on the highway in massive, staggered columns. It was a masterclass in chaotic organization. 2 by 2, they pulled out of the dirt lot, their tires spinning slightly in the mud before catching the wet asphalt. Huck was one of the last to leave. He was riding sweep. He didn't pull up to the bay to say a tearful goodbye. He didn't offer Keogh a patch or a secret handshake. He just paused his massive black road glide at the edge of the lot. He looked at the shop, looked at the boarded-up window, and finally looked at CO. He gave him a single, slow nod. CO didn't wave. He nodded back. Huck dumped the clutch, the rear tire kicking up a spray of dirty water, and roared off down the highway, chasing the tail end of the massive convoy. The noise didn't fade immediately. It lingered for nearly 20 minutes, a rolling thunder echoing off the distant tree line, a vibration that CEO could still feel in the soles of his boots. But eventually, the sound thinned out, swallowed by the miles and the falling rain. Then came the silence. It was absolute. It was the same silence that had lived in this shop for 2 years since his dad died. But as CEO stood there, listening to the rain hiss against the corrugated tin roof, he realized something fundamental had changed. The silence wasn't heavy anymore. It didn't feel like a judgment. It didn't feel like a tomb. It just felt quiet. Teo walked out into the center of the lot. The rain was cool against his face, washing the sweat and the grease and the smell of the exhaust from his skin. The ground was chewed up, scarred by hundreds of heavy tires, littered with cigarette butts and deep ruts. It looked like a battlefield after the armies had moved on. He turned around and looked at O'Connor Auto. The cinderblock paint was peeling. The roof sagged. The front window was a jagged sheet of plywood. It was an ugly, dying building. But it was his. Garrison was gone. The bank was paid. He had a top drawer full of dirty money that he was going to use to buy clean tools. He wasn't a hero. He hadn't magically become a tough guy. If the cousins came back next month, he'd still be terrified. Teo walked back into the bay. The floor was stained with fresh oil drips and spilled coolant. He walked over to the heavy red tool chest. His dad's chest. He pulled open the top drawer. The sockets were gleaming, perfectly organized in their rails. The ratchets were wiped clean. He reached out and picked up the half-inch drive. It was cold, heavy, and perfectly balanced in his palm. "Trust the metal?" the old biker had said. "It does what it's supposed to do if you ask it right." CO wasn't his father. He wasn't going to let the rust take him. He pulled his greasy overalls up over his shoulders, grabbed a push broom, and started sweeping the dirt out of the bay. He had work to do. Tayo's story isn't a fairy tale. There were no white knights, just 800 outlaws who paid their debts in dirty cash and unapologetic violence. Sometimes salvation doesn't wear a halo. It reeks of exhaust, stale tobacco, and burned rubber. It's a cynical, messy world, but sometimes a simple tire patch is all it takes to tilt the scales of karma in your favor. If this raw look at respect, grit, and survival kept you glued to your screen, hit that like button, share it with someone who knows the value of standing your ground, and subscribe to the channel for more deeply human stories. What would you have done with that envelope of cash? Let us know in the comments below.